Welcome to the Book Binge. I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today's video is reviewing this little book right here. Not that little, I guess, but it is littler than all of the other main books in the Wheel of Time. Book 8, The Path of Daggers, which I think a good bit of my opinion on this book is going to be some form of a hot take. Not intentionally so, but rather just because, in short, I think I liked The Path of Daggers a good bit more than I probably should have liked it, and probably even more than it deserves. Not just because of, general sentiment regarding the book, but just in terms of its actual structure. I would say that The Path of Daggers is, as more of an objective quote-unquote metric, the worst book of the Wheel of Time so far that I have read, and anybody who might assert that it is the worst book in the Wheel of Time entire, I'm at this point in time not inclined to disagree. Of course, I haven't read a couple of the future books, Winter's Heart or Crossroads of Twilight yet, but as of the point that I'm currently at now, yeah, I agree that this is definitely the weakest up to this point. And yet, in spite of that, in spite of its problems, I think I like this a little bit more than a couple other books in the series, maybe even a few other books in the series, if not for one, pretty glaring issue, I guess, within it, which of course we will talk about in due time. So before I get started on anything else in particular, let's start off with the good of The Path of Daggers, because I do think there is some good in here. So the main thing that I want to shout out here is basically my surprise at a couple of the things that I thought I would come into this disliking, but ended up liking quite a bit. The most notable part is the Perrin and Zareen plotline in The Path of Daggers, which was actually pretty interesting and did not aggravate me or annoy me. There were several moments where I might roll my eyes a little bit, and there were plenty of moments like that in the book throughout, but there was nothing that actually got on my nerves here regarding these characters like I was absolutely certain would be the case. Because up to this point, nearly every occurrence of Perrin and Zareen being together and interacting with each other, and or Zareen being too forefront in Perrin's thoughts, have been moments where I've just been annoyed or aggravated by certain priorities of things or the specific way he thinks about things. And again, there were moments where I still kind of rolled my eyes a little bit, particularly in the last chapter that Perrin and Zareen appear. There are a couple things about it, especially following some quote-unquote advice given to Perrin by another character, that leads to some eye-rolly type of descriptions that I'm like, it doesn't seem really realistic at all, and I think it's kind of odd, but at the same time, it wasn't enough to really offend me. So the fact that I enjoyed this plotline for what it was had me very surprised, quite frankly. Surprise is definitely the word for it. Similarly, I want to say that tertiary POVs, so kind of like side stories that have gone on in the series, have kind of been hit or miss. I think the secondary POVs, like the more relevant side plots, like the more major side plots, I guess you might say, the ones that get that have a dedicated storyline to them, even if they only appear in one or two chapters within the book, or within any given book, I suppose I should say, these secondary POVs tend to be okay. I like them. But tertiary POVs are very hit or miss, because oftentimes they're one-off characters that you don't see very often, if at all, ever again, or they're POVs that you don't get as POVs specifically very often, or they're filling in the gaps in very specific ways within the series that isn't, saying isn't relevant is wrong, but it isn't the most important, the most actively important information. Tertiary POVs can be hit or miss. I would say that aside from something that we'll talk about in the bad, the tertiary POVs of The Path of Daggers, and particularly the politics surrounding them, were all really good, actually, and pretty exciting, and had major implications for various different storylines and the way that certain things are going to converge and come together that I'm really looking forward to seeing, especially like the final stretch of the book, the last 100 pages or something, had a couple pages of tertiary POVs that were like, this is really good stuff, like really, really enjoyable material. Furthermore, I do want to say that the POVs that I was hoping to get a little bit more direct within this book, as opposed to, say, the last book or two, did get to be a little bit that way, or rather, stopped beating around the bush at one point or another within the Path of Daggers, and so became a little bit more, I guess, actively relevant to their own main plotline, to their own goals, actually getting to those points. So following the Bull of the Wind stuff, we get to see Elaine and the group around Elaine actually make their way towards Camelin, like Rand wanted Matt to be able to bring them to a couple books back, and we get to see a little bit more of that journey and what that actually means for them and the implications of that politically for some of those characters' future, particularly Elaine, of course, most especially in there. We also get to see the other girls' plot line, because for a couple books, I would just refer to the girls as Egwene and Elaine and Nynaeve, because it would be very, intertwined with each other. You could throw Avienda in there, and of course, like Birgit, but generally speaking, you also have those four, which kind of went on their own direction, but Egwene ended up splitting with them in Lord of Chaos, if I'm not mistaken, because it was in Lord of Chaos, like 2/3 of the way through Lord of Chaos when she split with them, because of where she ended up in her plotline, where she exists within the world now, her position. We also got to see her and some of the other the Rebel Aes Sedai, that group, also move a little bit more in a direction that was more forward-facing. There was a little bit of momentum there. Sure, a lot of that momentum was encouraged by politics rather than actual legitimate geographical movement, but the politics of that situation, getting into a position ready for, I guess, war, for better or worse, was engaging and enjoyable. I found the politics overall within this book to be especially good, even compared to previous books in the series, where Jordan has pretty much always excelled with the politics of the books. I would also say that the Path of Daggers in general is not horribly bloated, actually, not least because it is so short. It is the shortest mainline book in the series, but it's also because most of the major POVs in here only had a handful of chapters. Even Rand, as like the main character of the series, I believe only had 6 chapters where he was like the main, or basically the main POV in here. And there's only 30 chapters in general, so there's not a whole lot of material for each POV, but just enough to let them move, but without, getting bloated the way that I felt like, especially Lord of Chaos started to get, where like Rand's POV was like getting a little bit heavy-handed, and felt like it had multiple periods that could have been the beginning or the setup of a book, because it just kept on going and kept on going and kept on going. This book doesn't suffer from any of that, because basically in the aftermath of A Crown of Swords, most of the plot lines, but most particularly Rand's, ends up like, okay, now that this thing has happened, we get word of this other thing happening elsewhere in the world, let's just go take care of that, and then boom, it happens basically the next time he comes on page. And even though some of those moments are a little bit more slowly drawn out, I would say, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in the bad, again, the book itself doesn't feel very bloated. There are a couple points that could arguably be considered bloated, but it did definitely seem to me like Robert Jordan was actually putting things in place for the immediate future of the series, rather than just kind of meandering his way with it. At least that was how I felt about the Path of Daggers. On a related note, the end of the book was actually pretty good, even though I would say probably maybe the most, I guess, central aspect of the book, the climactic moment of the book, if you want to consider this book having a proper climax in and of itself, even though I was pretty underwhelmed by that, and again, we'll talk about that for the 50th time. We'll talk about that a little bit later. The actual ending of the book was really good. The final stretch, the last handful of chapters, were all really good because of the political implications that they give you, but also because you get to see all of the major storylines end up in a place that is a satisfying ending of sorts, ready for the immediate future. Most of those are sort of cliffhangery, but they are still satisfying endings. Even a storyline at the end of A Crown of Swords that does not appear, a major POV in that book that does not appear at all in The Path of Daggers, feels like it's in a place ready for the immediate future alongside all the major storylines that were pushed forward just a little bit in this book. So you feel like even though there's not a whole ton that happens in here that's like really major, there's some stuff in there that's pretty major, but most of it is like kind of major on a background scale, and it's just setting up for the more major forward moments. And again, a lot of those moments feel like they're right on the verge of really happening or blowing up, or you had something pretty major happen or blow up in such a way that they massively shift the way that the relevant POV characters are going to have to go on their storyline in the immediate future. That's something that I'm looking forward to exploring a little bit more. Speaking a little bit more generally about the book as well, the trends that I just tended to notice with The Path of Daggers for me were that the various characters, in regards to where various characters or groups stand in relation to one another, they were all solid. Like, you got to see the interpersonal dynamics with various characters in really interesting ways. You got to see certain characters behave or appear or even think to themselves in different ways. Rand especially feels notably darker in this book than he did previously, but he doesn't feel like a different character. He just feels much darker. He feels much changed, more or less, as an effect of some of the stuff that has just happened to him from like the end of Lord of Chaos until this book. Like, there's just a long train of pretty dismal events in his life that have led him into a mindset. It's like, I can't focus on this stuff, so I'm just going to be cold and dark to everyone because that's all I can afford to be, basically. So you get to see a bit of that. You also get to see some of the characters be a little bit softer in that way. Even Rand has a couple softer moments in the latter half of this book, but there's a lot of character work and the dynamics between them that feels pretty authentic, generally speaking, to me. There's also the fact that various antagonists, despite feeling like they're in relatively uncertain positions within the world at this point, the theories that they allow for me, because, you know, most of them being like the tertiary POVs that I was talking about earlier, most of them feel like they're right in a position where I'm like, I'm curious to know more about that. I'm looking forward to knowing more about that, looking forward to figuring out more. And I was able to come up with a couple theories about specific antagonist characters that, although they're probably really off base, actually engage me. I feel like I'm not able to make very many theories about the main characters, but I'm able to make theories about the antagonists in ways that feels intellectually engaging. And this book definitely allowed for that more so than some other books do, and I appreciated it. But of course, I think we should actually circle back around to some of the things that I didn't like as much about The Path of Daggers, notably some of the reasons why I think it is probably the weakest book in the series, regardless of if I enjoyed it more than it deserves or not. The main problems with this book are its structure. It is very, very weirdly structured, and as such, some of the pacing feels really off. Not necessarily because the pacing's bad, because I generally think the pacing is good within each individual storyline, but the way that things are kind of lined up gets a little bit weird at times. The main thing that I can note about this is that the prologue is just kind of a nothing burger of information that doesn't really feel relevant to any degree for this book. Like, nothing that happens in the prologue of The Path of Daggers is at all relevant to anything that happens within The Path of Daggers. That's kind of a problem for it, so it just feels very unmemorable and unmoving and doesn't really matter very much. The first 6 chapters after the prologue are also like the actual finale sequence of a plot line that starts in Lord of Chaos and takes through most of A Crown of Swords to go through, even though that storyline, the Bowl of the Wind stuff in A Crown of Swords, it sees an actual story arc. It goes through its arc and it has a climactic sequence at the end of that book. There's still, you know, one final step left to do with the bowl, and that's to actually use it in this book. So you see the first 6 chapters actually go along that path. And even though most of that is, well, some of that is pretty solid, there's a good bit of that that just felt a little bit drawn out to a degree. And there's the fact that it's another climactic moment for this storyline. It's ending off, tying up that little loose end there. And so coming at the very beginning of a book here just feels really off. A lot of the beginning of this book felt paced incredibly strangely because the first like quarter of it, the first 120 pages out of like 500 pages were just kind of like a prologue that didn't really feel like it did anything, and then finishing off a storyline rather than actually setting up or starting a book. So again, like the structure's a little bit weird, even though I feel like the end does a good job of getting POVs in a place, getting storylines in a place where they feel like they're ready to move on to the next step. I appreciate that Robert Jordan actually did that with this book, because a lot of the first half has some weird pacing and kind of structural decisions that just feel weird. Even if they don't always feel bad, they're definitely weird, and they don't really fit the conventional nature of a book, and it's kind of a problem at this point. Yeah, there's just too many plot lines, too many POVs, too many major POVs that are kind of in different places doing different things that cause this to be sort of a problem, I would say. I would also say, kind of along the lines of something I said earlier, the bloat problem in The Path of Daggers isn't that bad, but there are a couple moments where it's definitely kind of notable. The first 6 chapters especially, I feel like could have been like 4 chapters instead of 6, and you wouldn't have actually lost anything. There's just some character interactions, some arguments and bickering that didn't feel necessary. There's some moments within some other plot lines as well that just, you know, didn't fully need to drag out as long as they did. It wasn't a hugely prevalent problem, but I did notice it a handful of times throughout the book. The main problem that I would say with The Path of Daggers for me, however, is in relation to some of the storylines, kind of countering what I said in The Good, where, you know, some of the things that I thought I wouldn't like as much, I ended up actually liking quite a bit. Some of the stuff that I thought I would like a lot more in The Path of Daggers, I didn't end up liking quite as much. One of those things was the Bull of the Winds plotline, the sort of finale at the start of the book. It's good, it's fine, but it's definitely in the wrong place, so it feels worse than it should. I feel like it would have been a lot more enjoyable, would have been a lot better if it was at the end of A Crown of Swords, actually, or in some other place where like it would have felt more properly like the close of a storyline rather than, here, let's open this book with the end of a story. It's like, I don't know about that. It just feels weird. Something about it feels wrong because of that. And then the main thing that I've hinted at a lot in The Good and kind of been beating around the bush here is that Rand's overall storyline, the shining moment of it, what feels like should be the shining moment of the book, a sort of climax, kind of as I referenced it earlier, if you could call it a climax for The Path of Daggers, I was just very underwhelmed by. I'm not going to go into the spoilers of it, but many of these sort of like battle scenes going on within this sequence, within this string of like 4 chapters in the book, most of those scenes didn't do anything. They didn't reveal anything. They just kind of existed, and that's about it. They didn't actually move forward the battle in any interesting way. They were just kind of like little snippets of random stuff here and there. Just like, oh yeah, this is like an attempt to make you feel like you're in the battle because you're seeing different parts of it or in different places from different people. And it's like, yeah, but you literally have this one POV specifically here in this one moment making a maneuver, and then in the next scene he's in a completely different place because all of that sequence of the battle that he was implied to be a part of just has already happened or something. There were various moments of actual ongoing battle that were just straight up skipped in favor of seeing like the aftermath, or in favor of viewing something else from Rand's POV, because not to spoil it, but Rand's not really involved in the actual battle sequences of The Path of Daggers, so like he's just kind of getting it externally, and that feels really wrong when the setup to that, what little setup exists in this book, felt more like it was going to be really epic. I felt like there was going to be more to it. I wanted more from it. It just ended up being very meh. So the thing that I feel like was supposed to be the most epic part of The Path of Daggers just really underwhelmed me and wasn't that epic, actually, and just felt like it kind of wasted time on account of various different like little battle scenes here and there that again didn't really do anything and just felt like snippets of an overall broader picture where you didn't get enough snippets to actually see the broader picture, so you're just like yeah, that's basically how I felt about that. Additionally, there are a couple other problems that exist with the Path of Daggers, most primarily the exclusion of one of the major characters that I kind of hinted at earlier, which in a way kind of makes this similar to the Fires of Heaven in that way, but perhaps less weird this time, in my opinion, because even though I really like the Fires of Heaven, it's one of my 2 favorite books in the series. The Fires of Heaven has a problem with not including a POV entirely and not really having a justification for it. This time around, the major POV that is not included, you can actually kind of see why he's not included, not least because the period of time that the Path of Daggers takes place in is short enough where it's like, yeah, I could see why that would actually not be a major portion of the story. That makes sense. I can see that. I understand it. That's justified in my opinion. So I didn't have that much of a problem with this particular aspect, but it is definitely worth noting. One of my friends, this is his least favorite book in the series. And no small part of that is because the one character that he was really reading the series for by this point wasn't in here at all. And that's a pretty big detractor at that point. So fair enough. But given that the book's also pretty short, it's like 100,000 words or more. It's like 100, 110, maybe even 120,000 words shorter than the Fires of Heaven. It's okay that a major storyline isn't included because it has so much less, words to actually utilize to even include that in the first place, which could be both a good or a bad thing. I would argue that it's kind of what it is. I didn't mind it one way or the other. As for the ugly, the Path of Daggers is... Again, this is kind of where we talk about what I mentioned at the very beginning of this video, kind of what I said up top. I enjoyed the Path of Daggers more than I feel like I should have on account of its problems. I genuinely do not lie when I say that from book 1 all the way up through book 8, even if you include New Spring in between books 5 and 6, like where I included it, the Path of Daggers is the weakest book in the series up to this point. But again, it's not my least favorite one. The ugly is that I don't despise the Path of Daggers, in spite of its flaws, in spite of the more objective blemishes, as far as you can use objective for that kind of thing. I had a fun time with this book. Even though it's the worst book in the series so far, it is not my least favorite. Speaking on a ranking setting, I would say I'm a little bit hard pressed to actually rank any of the books up to this point. I mean, I have a general ranking in mind, but there's a solid 4 places in there where I'm kind of uncertain if things fall, where I'm thinking they might fall. I tried making one a little bit earlier, and I was, like I said, pretty hard pressed to actually finalize the ranking. At this point, I think I just need to let certain things sit a little bit longer before I actually know where things are placed, but I can say that my placement of the Path of Daggers alongside a Crown of Swords, these 2 are kind of interchangeable with each other. Now, if you've been following with my reading of a Crown of Swords, my review of that, I think I said that I didn't have a firm placement for a Crown of Swords either. That is still true for me at this point, but that it was maybe on the upper end of the 4-star scale for the series, because everything up through a Crown of Swords was at least 4 out of 5 stars, if not 5 out of 5. Most kind of split half and half between those 2 scores at that point. The Path of Daggers sits in a weird place where it's kind of interchangeable with a Crown of Swords wherever that may fall, because a Crown of Swords is a better book than the Path of Daggers, but there's some part of me that wonders if I'll think more fondly about the Path of Daggers than a Crown of Sword over time. Time will have to tell regarding that, because, to be clear, aside from the battle sequence that I complained so much about in the previous section, this was topping a Crown of Swords for the first half of the book, maybe even a little bit more than half. I was like, I like this more than a Crown of Swords even though I think it's weaker. I'm a little bit less certain about that because of the battle sequences, but even so, I think this is kind of sitting in a weird place for my ranking. It's almost a situation where I feel like I need to have a ranking of best to worst books in the series, which is trying to take a little bit more of the objective merits into account, and then favorite to least favorite, where I rank it according to my personal preferences. And those two would see like the bottom half of the lists kind of pretty different from each other, actually, would be the major differences between them. But, you know, when you consider that I enjoyed The Path of Daggers enough to make me want to go into Winter's Heart more or less immediately, if not for the fact that I have absolutely no time for the next month and a half to do so. Well, a month and a half at the time that I'm recording this, I should clarify, because this video isn't actually coming out for like a month after I'm recording it. So that kind of applies. But if I didn't have no time right now to be able to just jump right into Winter's Heart, I would be inclined to just jump into Winter's Heart, because I enjoyed this enough and I went through it quickly enough, and both it and Winter's Heart are short enough, the two shortest books in the series, that I could very well justify doing them back to back without risking too much burnout, the way that I would with basically any other books in the series. In the end, I think my rating for The Path of Daggers, even though I don't tend to do number scores in reviews for anything that I review on this channel, I don't really tend to do number scores because I don't like to. I prefer to keep those for my Goodreads reviews, where I can like script out and explain in very particular order why I feel the way that I do about a book, and have the score just kind of be context to that, or the review be context to the score. I would say The Path of Daggers is one of my rare like 3.5 star books. This one is one that I am, at the time of recording this, still unsure if I am going to round that 3.5 down to make The Path of Daggers my first 3-star for this series, despite my ranking it above a few books maybe of the series, or if I'm going to round it up to 4 stars just to keep it kind of in that company with the 4 stars. I still unsure about that yet. If not for the battle sequences being as mediocre as they were, it would be 4 stars. I would just be rating it 4 stars and not have any questions. But right now I've actually got to kind of weigh some of the goods, the pros and cons, and actually make that determination. So as far as a recommendation goes, it'll be kind of the same story as the last couple books in the series. By the time you've read, 8-9 books in a series, like I have, it's kind of hard to really say like yes or don't, or yes or no to whether I recommend a book. It's one that I like. I don't not recommend this. I didn't dislike the book. I don't think it's so awful that you should skip it, or maybe like read a summary like some people have tried suggesting for certain books in the slog, most particularly Crossroads of Twilight. But it's also a book that's like hard to say like I actively recommend it. I enjoyed my time enough with this that I'm not regretting the time that I've invested with the series. And again, I had a fun time with The Path of Daggers, a fun enough time that I want to read Winter's Heart, which should tell you that I did not dislike this book to any degree, as opposed to something like The Shadow Rising, where I was really struggling to determine whether I would continue in the future at that point. I knew that I would, but I also had like the parts of me that didn't really want to. There were also times during Lord of Chaos where things were getting bloated enough in the prose particularly that I was like, do I really want to deal with this for so many more books when I could just be reading other things at this point? So even though I've continued on, I would say that The Path of Daggers was one that I liked more than I think most other people do, and like more than probably most others are going to, at least in relativity to certain others of the last handful of the books, which is a hot take. That's going to be an unpopular opinion. I know most people seem to like the book less than me, so take my recommendation with a grain of salt. I think that if you're just generally invested in this series to the degree that I am, that you should just keep going, and that there's no reason not to do so, not to just keep going. And kind of similar to what I've been saying, if you're already miserable with the series up to this point, this book is not going to change your mind any more than A Crown of Swords is. In fact, this book is going to make you more miserable than A Crown of Swords did if you were already miserable by the time you got to that point in the series. So, like, by that point, I just dropped the series because it's not going to be worth it overall for you. That's probably what I'm going to be saying for the next 2 or 3 books as well. But who knows? I still got a few more books in this, like, sort of middle arc of the series, in between the second trilogy and the final trilogy, left to go. So I guess I'll talk to you guys here in a couple months whenever it is that I actually finish Winter's Heart and do a review for that. Although at the time of this video's release, it'll probably only be a few weeks before I start reading Winter's Heart in general. So if you want to follow along the Wheel of Time diaries, where I do spoiler talks and discuss my thoughts, not necessarily in real time, but as I'm reading specific portions of the books, consider doing that, and I would really appreciate it. But that will end my review of The Path of Daggers for today. I like this book a good bit, probably more than I should, maybe definitely more than it deserves, but I don't hate the book, so that's the bottom line of my thoughts. Thank you guys for watching this video. If you did, I really appreciate it. For now, I'm your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in whatever the next video is, because all of the other videos of May I recorded 15 million years ago, so I don't remember which one's coming next.